20 years later, there's still people that think that I killed JonBenet, that Patsy killed JonBenet, that my son Burke killed JonBenet. Those accusations are wrong and they're abhorrent.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Welcome to episode 19 in the ongoing series going through the JonBenet Ramsey countdown. As I said in the previous episode, we're going to deal with noon to around about 6 p.m. on the 26th of December, 24 years ago today. Now obviously we already falling a bit behind. It's the 29th of December now, but there's just so much to deal with on the 26th. And so we will try and catch up the time that we've lost. And I would say probably around about by the time that we've caught up all the lost time, you know, the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and so on, by then probably the series will terminate, which will probably be towards the end of the first week in January. But this episode promises to be quite riveting, I think. We are going to touch on an area that is very difficult to touch on without getting into trouble. It's the subject of Burke Ramsey, and we're going to look at Burke's story on the 26th, and the first time that the police actually spoke to him in a, let's call it a semi-formal manner. We've actually got a statement from Detective Patterson, so we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at Burke Ramsey in a way that I don't think has been looked at before by anyone, by any narrator, by any of the books that are written on the topic. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research that I did into that for this episode, and it'll just give you an idea about the approach of True Crime Rocket Science. Okay. But before we get to the timeline, if you haven't subscribed, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. A big thank you to the 100 or so subscribers that have subscribed since the last episode and those who've joined Patreon. And let's get started. So we will begin with the timeline, just a sort of generic timeline from the PB Works site. I'll again put a link to that so you can go through it on your own. We're not obviously going to dig into it very deeply. We're just going to kind of gloss through the timeline. Basically, at about 12:30, Detective Arndt notices John Ramsey by himself. And this is from Steve Thomas's notes. Something that I actually came across while researching this was that John Ramsey, when he was questioned, pointed out that Fleet White, who was on the scene, was writing frantic notes, just like making a lot of notes. And in his interview, he actually just wrote, he said, writing. Those were his words to describe what Fleet White was doing. And obviously on those sort of yellow notepads that were in the Ramsey house. And of course, Fleet White was writing down, I guess, his thoughts and things, almost like a to-do list. But of course, this was now obviously going to direct the cops' attention to Fleet White. Let's look at his handwriting. Let's look at whether he wrote the ransom note. Let's look at whether he has a motive and all that kind of thing. And if you think about it just in a basic way, Fleet White was one of John Ramsey's best friends and now has become a suspect, right, very early on. So at about the same time that Arndt noticed John Ramsey kind of on his own, she called the Boulder Police Department. She actually called Larry Mason. Now, I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail here, but Arndt kind of got the heebie-jeebies. For whatever reason, she started suspecting, seeing John as a suspect. She started to feel convinced that there was something wrong with this guy. And bear in mind, John is a bit of a strange guy. Keeps to himself. Someone described him as invisible. I think it was Megan Kostenik's mother, Barbara. That was her impression of him. And anyway, the detective's getting the heebie-jeebies now. And something's about to happen. Right? And so at 1 o'clock, Arndt talks with Fleet White, not with John, with John's friend. And so she approaches Fleet White, and she asks him to occupy John's mind. Like, she's basically asking Fleet to settle John down, kind of thing. And then she asks him to look through the house to see if anything was amiss. And Fleet told Detective Arndt that it would have more of an impact coming from her. So in other words, Fleet said, why don't you ask him, kind of thing, and asked her if she would ask John, right? And this is an entry in Steve Thomas's notes, given it gives the timestamp for this discussion at about 1 o'clock, but it must have happened a little bit before that, because the search through the house, that fateful search, actually happened at 1 o'clock. So anyway, Detective Arndt suggested to Fleet White that John check the house from top to bottom, and she actually emphasized this in the subsequent interview, that she said, go and look through the house from top to bottom, right? And so what happens is John then looks through the house from bottom to top. He basically goes straight to the wine cellar. I do think you can rightly criticize Arndt for doing this, because there had to have been 100 different ways to get John to settle down. You could have perhaps turned on the television or the radio, or I don't know, just something else, gotten him to sit in the room with everybody else. And obviously it wasn't John or Fleet's job to search the house for clues. It was kind of her job. And another thing you could have kind of criticized the officer for is she could have gone with him. She could have gone with John through the house and said, okay, what do you think about this? Or with John and Fleet. The problem is she's now leaving all the women unattended, kind of thing. So that was the sort of thing that she was facing. Again, I don't really understand why this is such a big deal, why the timeline sort of argues with itself about, was this discussion at 1 p.m. or before 1 p.m. It just doesn't really matter. The point is that it was something that came up, right? So at about 1 p.m. John and Fleet search the basement. They go straight down to the basement, and according to Steve Thomas's notes, he immediately went to the basement door with Fleet White following. So now bear in mind, John's kind of gotten almost like a license. He's gotten permission to go through the house and kind of report back, right? And John's kind of spent the whole morning, bear in mind he's a very busy businessman, successful businessman, just sort of sitting around. And he couldn't have enjoyed it. Couldn't have enjoyed that sort of drama and pointlessness of it. But the other issue is Fleet White is with him. So if he's got anything to hide, if there's anything he doesn't want Fleet to see, it's important that he is sort of a couple of steps ahead of Fleet White. Does that make sense? In other words, if he does something, he needs to get there a little bit ahead of Fleet White. And it's a little bit of a similar situation to when Chris Watts entered the home ahead of everybody else. He kind of got about a 1 minute head start, but you also see him running around the house and no one's sort of with him. He's sort of kind of on his own mission, if you can put it that way. And so if there's anything to pick up, hide, cover over, whatever, I'm talking about Chris Watts, he had a little bit of time because there's no one right by him. He had a couple of seconds to do that, which would have probably been enough. And so one wonders, was the same situation playing out here? And so anyway, so John goes directly to the basement, and they first go into the train room and they examine the broken window, and John says he broke it a few months ago. Now, we'd spoken earlier about neglect. Is there any sign of neglect from the Ramseys? Here's yet another sign that they there's a broken window in the house, and I believe that that is true, that the window was broken. And it remains broken for months. Anyway, then they searched for glass on the floor, and then they went to look at the broom closet, and then to the wine cellar. And that's where John Ramsey found quote unquote, JonBenet Ramsey. The search warrant says that John Fernie was also present during the search, which is kind of strange. But it's not true. I don't quite know where it says that in the search warrant, but it's probably just an error if it is there. So it's Byfeld, 1997. John Ramsey immediately went to the basement, followed by Fleet White and John Fernie. Other accounts make no mention of Fernie. Anyway, later that afternoon, Mr. Ramsey and Mr. White together returned to the basement at the suggestion of the Boulder police. During this joint search of the basement, the men first examined the playroom and observed the broken window. Mr. White moved the grate so the closet could be searched. Upon finding nothing unusual in the closet, the men proceeded to the wine cellar. John must have felt that it was going to be inevitable that JonBenet was going to be found. It was inevitable, and so and at this point he kind of found her. So it's sort of reported that at 1 1:04, JonBenet's body was found, and so it had probably been in where it was for around about 13 hours, right? So JonBenet's cadaver had been where it was found probably around about 13 hours, possibly even longer than that. It's also possible that it had only been moved there, say, perhaps 7 hours earlier. It's difficult to say, but that's quite a long time. And obviously, by the time they found her body, bear in mind when the police arrived at about 6 o'clock. So if you take from 6 o'clock till 1 o'clock, that's 7 hours. We know that for sure for 7 hours, JonBenet's body was wherever it was, and that would mean that she would be very, very cold to the touch. There'd be some discoloration in her face. It was a very cold day as well, but there would be no doubt that she was dead when you found her, if I can put it that way. I can also tell you, not that long ago, I was narrating a video, and I sort of turned in my chair, and there was a dead dove next to my chair on the ground, and the dog was sort of about a meter away from it, and obviously the dog had brought it into the office. This was in the middle of the night, and the moment I picked the body of the bird up, I knew it was dead. How did I know? Because it was quite hard. If you've ever kept birds, you know just how soft and kind of vulnerable their bodies are. It's almost like a pom-pom that you can kind of squeeze. And this bird was quite hard to the touch. Also, it kind of had that look on its face, if I can put it that way, the eye and the beak, where you could just tell immediately that it wasn't alive. There were other cues as well, that there were some ants walking over it, and I can't say that there was a smell. I didn't really try and smell the bird. I did then immediately go downstairs and I put it in the trash can. Now, I have previously buried dead birds in my garden, kind of at the far end of the garden, but this was kind of right in the middle of the night, and I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to do that in the middle of the night. And I realized it's not a very nice thing to do, just throw this thing away like garbage, but it was the middle of the night. But I think it is interesting just from a human psychology perspective that this bird was right next to me on the first floor, and I took it to the far end of the house. The kitchen trash can is kind of almost the furthest point from where I'm sitting right now, and is right beside a door, and that door, you sort of take the trash out, and then it goes from there to an area where the trash is left. And I can tell you a little bit more about that, but I think let's get back to the the issue here. So when John found JonBenet, and this is something we could go into a lot of detail, I just am not going to do that. But his kind of version of events was that he thought that she might be alive. And he was sort of cried out, "Oh my God, my baby." And I just find that a little bit far-fetched, because even when he carried her up, so he immediately contaminated the crime scene, immediately pulled off the duct tape that was on her mouth. I think he also removed part of the cord that was around her wrist, not the other cord, just the one cord. And then he sort of ran upstairs, and the way that I recall it, I could be wrong, but the way that I recall it, Fleet White cried out, whereas John just sort of ran upstairs without really saying anything. And then John subsequently, this is the way I understand it, I could be wrong, John subsequently said that, yes, he also sort of cried out. Now, we can go through that in Death of Innocence, his discovery of the child, but that is not the focus of this particular episode. So if I don't get to it, remind me to get to it, the John's own version in his book of finding. I seem to recall him saying something like he felt a scream in his throat. In other words, he felt himself screaming, he just didn't actually scream. And then Fleet White screamed, which I think is quite interesting. But the other thing is that when he carried JonBenet up the stairs, she had kind of rigor mortis, to the extent that her arms were sort of protruding in front of him, and it was kind of like he was carrying this smelly doll who was stiff, and he was holding her out kind of almost at a arm's length. So he wasn't carrying her sort of over his shoulder or against his body, he was sort of holding her away from him. And then he ran up the stairs, and then he placed her on the ground in the hallway at Aaron's feet. And obviously this was kind of the worst place to put her, because it's where all the foot traffic went through. And then he went from there and placed her kind of almost under the Christmas tree on the carpet, which is the second worst place. And then after that he covered her in a throw rug or something from the furniture, which is the third worst thing to do. And Patsy threw herself over her child and all this kind of thing. And obviously this was almost the worst case scenario from a police crime management perspective. And Detective Arndt has copped kind of quite a lot of flack for that. The other interesting thing is Fleet White calls for an ambulance, not John Ramsey. John Ramsey kind of wants to take his cue from Detective Arndt, like, what should I do? What's going on? And Arndt has kind of got to say, okay, well, she's obviously dead. She's got to tell him. It's almost like John Ramsey's the last to know that his daughter's died. And she's got to tell him, and obviously also to move away from her. So, as I say, Fleet White calls for the ambulance. I think he also ends up calling 911. Fleet White actually says, tell someone to call 911. It's also interesting that John Ramsey doesn't say, call 911, right? It's also interesting that what Fleet White does is he runs upstairs and he grabs the phone in the back office and yells for someone to call an ambulance. Now, bear in mind there was that botched or dropped 911 call earlier. And as I understand this, again, I could be wrong, there was a certain protocol to getting an outside line on that phone. I think you had to dial 1 first. And I think Fleet White was struggling to actually make use of the phone. He was struggling to, which seems to show that he didn't know how the phone worked, which would tend to exclude, theoretically, Fleet White from making the botched 911 call or the dropped 911 call on December 23rd. So if Fleet White didn't make that call, who did? And I think one of the stories was that Fleet White was phoning for medication for his grandmother, or something like that. And so this tends to throw some kind of cold water on that possibility. At 13:05, Byfield was notified that JonBenet's body had been found, Jim Byfield. It's just interesting that JonBenet's father ripped the duct tape off her mouth, and that was a very important piece of evidence. It had pieces of fiber and stuff behind it, on the sticky side of it. Arndt then, so then he set JonBenet down on the floor, and then Arndt picked the body up and moved it to the living room, so near the Christmas tree. So even that, Arndt should really have just left it where it was, kind of thing. And then Patsy, I think, John knelt beside her, repeating "My Little Angel." This is to kind of an audience, over and over. And then friends carried Patsy to the body, and police described her throwing herself over JonBenet. So you can kind of imagine this hysterical scene. Arndt requested backup, declaring a code black. Everett searched the basement. This is after 1305. And now they found the blanket, and they found the high-tech footprint in the sort of dirt. And they found a framed image there in the basement with the words SBTC on it. And now it is basically a crime scene. In fact, a homicide scene. And so at 1312, Detective Arndt grabbed a cell phone in the kitchen and dialed 911 and reached the dispatcher. So it's quite interesting that she had to call 911, not one of the folks in the house. And it's quite late, 7 minutes since the body was found, took them to call 911. Then at between 20 past 1 and 25 past 1, officers Weiss and Everett arrived. If we just gloss through the rest, at 1322, Officer Alaric Morgan relayed Officer French from the BPD to the scene. So Officer French is now sent back to the scene. 1329, Detective Arndt received a page stating a call was received by Weld County. Does that ring a bell? 1330, Priscilla White phones home. And obviously at that point, Burke was at the house. And we're going to deal with that for the remainder of this episode. 1330, John phones Gary Merriman. 1330, Walker and Mason searched the basement. They saw JonBenet's body in the living room and then searched the basement and the wine cellar. Mason decides to secure the house a little bit late. 1330, Priscilla White calls her niece at the White's home to report the murder. John calls his pilot. 20 minutes later, after Arndt moves the body, John is overheard placing a phone call to his pilot to ready the plane to head for Atlanta. It's quite interesting. John wants to kind of skedaddle, and they've got to tell him, well, you can't leave town. You'll need to stay at a friend's home in Boulder. You can't stay in your home. And in fact, the Ramseys would never stay in their home ever again after that. They effectively lost their home as a result of what happened here. At just before 1345, John Ramsey's children arrived. That's his stepchildren, so John, Andrew, and Melinda. And so they've arrived about half an hour, about 40 minutes after JonBenet's body's been discovered. Then at about 1415, John Ramsey signed a search form, but there's no documentation for this. The Ramseys then left for the Fernies at about this time. At the time that his children arrived, they then left for the Fernies, and that's of course where John kind of started getting his lawyers involved, starting with Mike Bynum. Officer French leaves the residence for the second time at about 1345 as well. And Officer Weiss and Shunk are securing the front and back of the house. At 1345, Sergeant Larry Mason arrives at the Ramsey residence. At 1345, FBI agent Ron Walker arrives at the Ramsey residence. At 1350, the house is secured. At 1430, Detective Arndt visits the Ramseys at the Fernie's house. At 14:30, Burke is interviewed by Boulder Police Department. At approximately the same time, Detective Patterson talked to Burke Ramsey at the White House. Burke reportedly had slept through the events of the previous night. That's from Schiller's book. And I think that is going to be the end of the preview for the folks on YouTube. From here on, we're going to deal with Burke as a separate subject. We're going to deal with something that is very strange and something that many haven't seemed to notice, is that Burke Ramsey's bed is the only bed that is made up of the Ramsey family. So John and Patsy Ramsey's bed isn't made in their bedroom. JonBenet's bed isn't made in her bedroom, but Burke's bed is made in his bedroom. Now, what is going on there? And that is what we're going to start off with in the exclusive segment on Patreon. I'll probably be doing a part 2 on the Nashville bomber. Just there's some more information that has come to light, so I'll probably do an extended version on Warner's motive. So those on YouTube, look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
Based on the interview that I had with Burke, it appeared to me he had no idea that his sister